Pleasure and an honor to be here today. I guess I'd like to start by thanking you, Stefan, for your friendship, for being a great colleague. You are an absolutely essential person in our world, and you'll be badly missed. I'm going to use my comments focusing on the U.S. context, and I'll address three main points. First, the Federal Reserve's monetary policy independence is an important and broadly supported institutional arrangement that has served the American public well. Second, the Fed must continuously earn that independence by using our tools to achieve our assigned goals of maximum employment and price stability, and by providing transparency to facilitate understanding and effective oversight by the public and their elected representatives in Congress. Third, we should stick to our knitting and not wander off to pursue perceived social benefits that are not tightly linked to our statutory goals and authorities. So starting with the first point, as Ken and others have pointed out, on the first point, the case for monetary policy independence lies in the benefits of insulating monetary policy decisions from short-term political considerations. Price stability is the bedrock of a healthy economy and provides the public with immeasurable benefits over time. But restoring price stability when inflation is high can require measures that are not popular in the short term as we raise interest rates to slow the economy. The absence of direct political control over our decisions allows us to take these necessary measures without considering short-term political factors. And I believe that the benefits of independent monetary policy in the United States and more broadly around the world are well understood and broadly accepted. However, in a well-functioning democracy, important public policy decisions should be made in almost all cases by the elected branches of government. Grants of independence to agencies like ours should be exceedingly rare, explicit, tightly circumscribed, and limited to those issues that clearly warrant protection from short-term political considerations. With independence comes the responsibility to provide the transparency that enables effective oversight, in our case by Congress, which in turn supports the Fed's democratic legitimacy. And at the Fed, we treat this as an active, not a passive responsibility. Over the past several decades, we've steadily broadened our efforts to provide meaningful transparency about the basis for and the consequences of the decisions that we make in service to the American people. We are tightly focused on achieving our statutory mandate and on providing useful and appropriate transparency. On the third point, it is essential that we stick to our statutory goals and authorities and that we resist the temptation to broaden our scope to address other important social issues of the day. Taking on new goals, however worthy, without a clear statutory mandate would undermine the case for our independence. In the area of bank regulation, as Tobias mentioned, the Fed has a degree of independence, as do the other federal bank regulators. Independence in this area helps ensure that the public can be confident that our supervisory decisions are not influenced by political considerations. And today, some analysts ask whether incorporating into bank supervision the perceived risks associated with climate change is appropriate, wise, and consistent with our existing mandates. Addressing climate change seems likely to require policies that would have significant distributional and other effects on companies, on industries, on regions, and on nations. Decisions about policies to directly address climate change should be made by the elected branches of government and thus reflect the public's will as expressed through elections. At the same time, in my view, the Fed does have a narrow but important responsibilities regarding climate-related financial risks. These responsibilities are tightly linked to our responsibilities for bank supervision. The public reasonably expects supervisors to require that banks understand and can appropriately manage their material risks, including the financial risks of climate change. But without explicit congressional legislation, it would be inappropriate for us to use our monetary policy or supervisory tools, for example, to promote a greener economy or to achieve other climate-based goals. We are not, and we will not be, a climate policy maker. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you all four for these lucid remarks. Now you'll have a chance to agree or disagree with anything the other panelists just said, or you can also get into one of our main questions that you didn't cover in your initial remarks, especially if you have views on desirable reforms of central bank independence and mandates. Mervyn?
Well, I just want to say how strongly I agree with what Jay Powell just said about mandates. Independence from politicians is a great responsibility, and it cannot be misused by trying to creep into areas which have not been explicitly delegated by the appropriate political process. And the way I think about it is this, that nobody would ever create a central bank to prevent pandemics. Nobody would ever create a central bank to combat climate change. They would create a central bank to try to ensure price stability, and they would create a central bank in order to try to maintain stability of the financial system. So I think if you're going to have central bank independence, you should always remember the maxim, which I think is crucial for any agency, which is only do what only you can do. And there are plenty of other people who can take measures to combat climate change. And I worry that people, in the great enthusiasm for doing good, are actually putting at risk central bank independence.
Others? Ken?
Well, not necessarily to the three questions, but just expanding slightly.
Yeah, please.
I think, particularly when interest rates were hovering around zero, one of the challenges to central bank independence was the idea we don't need it for stabilization policy anymore. That's very popular among a significant group of academics. In fact, if you look at a poll of the American Economic Association and compare what they said in 2000, where that was not considered to be a good idea by most, the considerable majority did think it was a good idea by 2021. And no one introduced Torsten, but he's made giant contributions in political economy, along with his co-author Guido Tabellini, also Lars Svensson, who's here, and the late Alberto Alesina. And this just seems to have been forgotten, that I will see, I'll pick on him, Paul Krugman, draw an IS and LLM curve, and he says, well, you could shift the IS curve, that's fiscal policy, or you could shift the LM curve. You can kind of do one or the other. Well, I mean, fiscal policy is actually the sum of tens of thousands of different policies which are hardwired politically, and the fiscal policy is absolutely necessary in many cases. And of course, when a catastrophe, a pandemic, a financial crisis hits, it's less political. But in most cases, the independence of the central bank gives it this ability to approach things more technocratically and fairly quickly, that where fiscal policy needs time to sort out the political dimensions of things.
Well, I mean, one reflection that I have when I listen to the panel here and also looking at the questions how central bank independence has evolved over time, I think it's certainly important that we also see it as a generational issue. So to what extent does the young generation, I think that was very interesting what you said, like in the 90s there was still the memory of higher inflation, and I also alluded to the discussion of the situation in Germany in the 50s, where actually the politicians seemed to be tempted, when you read the account of the historians, to have a little bit less independent central banks, but the public was still so much aware of the high inflation that they pushed that the public opinion pushed towards more and more independence together with the US authorities at the time. And I wonder whether today we're reaching the younger population and explain to them why central bank independence is so important. And I think that's also part of our outreach that we have to do.
Jay?
So I'll admit to not really answering the third question. But I'll take a shot at it now if I can. So The question being, did either the global financial crisis or the pandemic and the responses to them, does it suggest that there are problems with the mandate, unforeseen tensions between either financial stability and monetary policy and that sort of thing? And I guess I would take the position that that would not be my takeaway at all. I think what happened in both crises is that central bankers used their tools pretty innovatively to deal with exceptionally unforeseen and difficult circumstances. I think the main takeaway from the global financial crisis was the need to build a far more resilient core of the financial system. And we did that, the banks did that, we did that, all over the world people did that, and I think that financial system now is now substantially more resilient and more strong at its core. I think it held up better in the pandemic as a result. The pandemic was a different thing. It was it called for a whole of government response from a medical standpoint, and it called for use of fiscal policy and monetary policy tools in unprecedented ways. There had been a concern in the United States that Dodd-Frank had too limited the Fed's authority under Section 13.3 to do facilities and lending. The new system actually worked quite well. What it did was it required the Treasury's, the elected part of the government's approval for these emergency lending facilities, and that actually worked very well. And that's actually an appropriate thing, because these are extraordinary measures. We only have the authority during emergencies, and to have the elected government approving it, it was a very constructive process between us and the Treasury. So I guess to take a step back, I think that the tools that we have work. I think there's nothing wrong with our mandates. I don't see anything about the laws that govern us or provide our mandates that needs to be changed, and it seems to have worked pretty well in these two very difficult circumstances.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yet there is somehow, at least to some of us, a difference in the reaction in the 90s and the reactions now. So in the 90s, the public enemy number one had been inflation, as Mervyn and Ken had discussed, and that was an outcome of decision making that wasn't useful and was subject to discredibility problems. And what we tried to do then was to construct a more robust framework in terms of institutional reform that would produce better decisions that would keep inflation low. Now the public enemy number one, arguably over the next 25, 30 years, were these repeated financial crises or risks of financial crisis. And it's true that there was, of course, much more regulation of the financial sector, but not to the same extent, trying to address by institutional measures the underlying decisions in this arena. By banks, yes, but not necessarily by policymakers. So is there a case, Mervyn, you have strong thoughts on who should be responsible for financial stability and macroprudential policies? Do the events that we went through during that dramatic era of the great financial crisis made you rethink those issues?
Well, I think the answer is yes, because when the Bank of England was made independent in 1997, actually both the then governor, Eddie George, and myself were quite content, despite some press speculation to the contrary, that bank regulation would go to a separate body. But the reason was that at that point, supervision of banks was really all about depositor protection. It was about elimination of insider trading, fraud, etc. It wasn't about a historical bank run and about inadequate prudential regulation. And really in the 5 years before the financial crisis, that's when you saw the leverage of the banking system increase very rapidly, so that it did become very fragile. And I think after that, I was very struck that when the to-be Prime Minister David Cameron and George Osborne, the Chancellor, came to see me, their argument for putting regulation back in the Bank of England was essentially that the only institution that people will trust is the central bank. Therefore, you need to take some of this back. Now, you can argue, I think, whether some of the details of regulation needs to be inside or outside the central bank, that's a less important thing. But the principles of ensuring, as Jay said, that the banking system was sound, I think are ones that central banks have to be involved in. But deep down, it seems to me the big difference between the way policy was set in certainly the 80s and early 90s and today is this business of recognizing that the quid pro quo of central bank independence is communication, explanation, and clarity of that communication. The great American economist Bob Solow once said that an economist needs 3 qualities: faith, hope, and clarity. And the greatest of these is clarity.
Excellent.
Torsten, can I just say something in response to your comment? I mean, inflation's back. So yes, if you'd asked that question in 2021, maybe, people said, well, financial crises, but I think you need a framework that, as Jay was saying, is stable over the full cycle of things that are happening and doesn't get, it gets tuned, but and also, let's look at the rest of the world, please. I think if we're looking at developing economies, emerging markets, which are also struggling to find frameworks, that I wouldn't tell the IMF to change what it's doing in terms of central bank independence.
All right. So maybe we'll go to the section when the public is involved, the Q&A session. So if you want to say something, please raise your hand. If you want to pose a question, if you do get the mic, please start by saying your name. Please be succinct, and please try to relate to the overall theme of the of the panel. Okay, Richard Portes, please.
Yeah, we're coming through. Richard Portes, London Business School and European Systemic Risk Board, where I have learned over several years a great deal from Stefan English. No more of that now, but maybe later. I'm not totally convinced that we now have a resilient system. Mark Carney said that in 2017 as his final statement from the Financial Stability Board. But then the banks, yes. But we found in early 2020 that that wasn't true of the non-banks, in particular the money market funds, and the central banks had to step in. Central banks don't like to do that, quite rightly. They don't like to have to act as market makers of last resort. And that may be a compromise of the mandate. So the questions that I would put to the panel, as we've seen, as we've seen very recently, the rise in nominal rates is exposing financial fragilities in the system. They came from the search for yield, whatever you want to call it. And we saw an extreme example of that in the United Kingdom in September of this past year. Now, in those circumstances, should financial stability be explicitly in the mandate? Should we be recognizing reality, what central banks actually do in practice? Would that help avoid financial dominance if it were in the mandate? Given the huge costs of financial crises, is financial dominance in a sense inevitable? Recognize reality and put financial stability in the mandate. Why not?
Who wants to take a stab on that?
I mean, in a sense, it is in the mandate, most central banks now. And I think it needs to be linked explicitly to the instruments of central banks. This was the problem before. And the obvious instrument is whether you call it lender of last resort to banks or the equivalent to the non-bank sector. And I think that the central banking community is very focused on the question of defining the circumstances and the nature of institutions that happen to be non-banks that would merit an intervention. And I think that the only way to handle this is to have a framework which is set out ex ante, which actually tries to identify clearly the circumstances and the institutions that would merit lending from the central bank, but also ensures that the scale of that intervention is also under the control of the central bank and not something which the actors themselves in the financial system can expand to almost any number simply by the actions that they take. It's ensuring that there is enough collateral against which to lend by the central bank. Now, I think the central banking community is well aware of these problems. It doesn't make them easy. It doesn't mean that you can do it in a week. But my guess is, yes, you're right, Richard, that there will be an expansion of the mandate and that it's there in principle, but it needs to be made much more concrete by saying what are the institutions, what are the circumstances, whether it's maturity mismatch or something else that would justify an intervention, and to have sufficient regulation on that degree of maturity mismatch ex ante to limit the size of the intervention.
Claudia?
Yeah, no, I agree that to some extent the framework for central banks to be involved in macroprudential policy is well defined. So the Bundesbank, according to the German financial stability law, has a clear mandate in that regard. It's a joint mandate with the supervisory authority and with the Ministry of Finance, because as we all know, there's a lot of distributional implications that macroprudential policy decisions can have. So it's not us alone, and I think also the ECB has clarified in its strategy review how monetary policy and financial stability interact. The one point that I would like to make in addition is that we also do have frameworks for evaluation of policies and whether we've done enough. So the FSB, the Financial Stability Board, started this big project in 2017 and looked at the reforms that have been implemented, found no major side effects, found that a lot has been achieved, but there are still also gaps when it comes to resolution reform. So I think also for the areas that you mentioned, the non-bank financial intermediation space, we clearly have to implement policies and look at the resilience in that part. So I fully agree. We can never say that the job is done and we can all lay back. That's what we're there for.
Jay, please.
Just to add, in the same spirit, I think that what the pandemic revealed was weaknesses in the non-bank financial sector, much as the global financial crisis revealed those weaknesses in the big banks and the large utilities, financial market utilities. And so there has been, as Claudia was saying, and Mervyn was saying, there's a lot of effort going into and has been in what do you do about money market funds? What do you do about the treasury market? These things are and I think the first order answers need to be changes to the structure of these institutions to make them stronger, more resilient on their own. I would say expanding the provision of central bank liquidity is not the desired response. It really is to strengthen these institutions. Our capital markets are quite vibrant and very different in what they do from what the banks do. And I wouldn't want to see the kind of prudential regulation that goes along with liquidity provision. I don't think it wouldn't be great to extend that too much into the non-bank financial sector. I'd rather work on structural reforms, which is kind of what we've been doing.
Klaus Eklund.
Thank you. Torsten, you mentioned that you did graduate studies together with Stefan. I can add that I actually made undergraduate studies together with Stefan, so I'm even older. But a question of independence. It seems that you have mainly been discussing central bank independence from, let's call it political pressure, and of course partisan pressure would be even worse. But there's something more subtle about the independence issue, which I think we can discuss in Sweden right now. I'm personally interested in that. I worked in the finance ministry many years ago, but I was also on the general board of the Riksbank, Riksbanksfullmäktige, not the board of directors, but the general board before, in the old evil days, before independence. Anyway, in Sweden we have 4 institutions: the Riksbank, the Financial Supervisory Authority, the Debt Office, and of course the Ministry of Finance. And they often work with similar issues, obviously. And they often have to cooperate. So the question here is, how independent can the central bank be in reality? To what extent must the central bank discuss, compromise, lean against the wind or with the wind, and be politically agile at the same time as it is formally independent? Maybe it sounds like a stupid question, but I think actually this is almost as important as the, let's call it the big issue of political independence. I'd like to hear sort of your experiences from this. How independent can the central bank really be?
Can I start by saying, I think we have to distinguish between monetary policy independence, where the case, I think, is very strong, from all the other activities of the central bank. So as a regulator, the United States Fed's very powerful, but there are many other regulators it deals with. And I think the same is true in most countries. So that it's very different conceptually, and I think all regulators, we'd like to be independent from over political influence and being bought off, or, you know, even if it's only psychically held hostage by those that it regulates. But I think that's, the central bank in general, and looking at all its functions, it clearly has to coordinate with other agencies. It clearly has to be subordinate to political policy, as we had in the first session here.
So I can speak from my experience, which was that between 1997, when the Bank of England was made independent, and 2013, when I left, there wasn't a single episode where the elected politicians put pressure on the bank to adopt one interest rate policy or change rather than any other. Whereas, as Jay talked about, the facilities that were put in place in the US under the new regime, which was meant in some sense to give more control to elected politicians, we in the Bank of England in 2010 really introduced a compact between the Treasury and the Chancellor on the one hand and the Bank of England on the other, which said that any lender of last resort operation had to be approved by the Treasury. That seems to me perfectly reasonable and appropriate. And you have a private conversation where you explain why you want to do it. And in very few cases could I imagine that the Treasury would say, if the central bank feels that a lender of last resort operation is appropriate to prevent some collapse, the idea that the Treasury is going to say you can't do it, I think is not likely to be true. But since taxpayers' money is at risk, it's perfectly reasonable for the Treasury to have an input on it. There was never any conflict between these two different approaches in the different areas of policy. So I think the important thing is for it to be quite clear what that policy responsibility is, whether it's in the US with changes in legislation or the compact agreed between the bank and the Treasury in the UK. It's quite clear what the lines of responsibility are and who has to be consulted. That's the important thing. That's what prevents, I think, things going very wrong. It's where different institutions or players all feel that they are the people responsible for a particular policy that you get difficulties.
Yeah, or to express it differently and perhaps more simply, it's a big difference between taking the decision in deliberation with others or taking it after deliberation with others.
Yeah.
And that's the responsibility point, right? So, yes, please.
Thank you very much for the panel. Joachim Nagel for the Bundesbank. Let me put it like this. I think it was already said by Ken Rockoff. I think inflation is back now. We are more or less, in my interpretation, still in the midst of a storm, and the storm is not over. So we have to do our job, our main mandate. This is our role. During the last 10, 12 years, we were the most welcome partners of the politicians because we, in our independent role, we did everything to fight against all the financial crisis and did what we did. But this came with a price. And now in the next years, the politicians have to learn that monetary policy is coming with a price. So maybe some of us, they have to announce that there are maybe losses or not the profits we came up in the past. What is your opinion about that? Is that influencing the way we are being perceived in the future about our independency?
Who wants to take that on?
Well, I'll take it on. It's related to something that I said, which is that the pressures from politicians will be greater and more complex today than they were in the 1990s. And you're absolutely right. But I don't think it's an issue about the mandate of the central bank. That is unchanged. It's that some people in positions of political responsibility will learn that life can be difficult. But I don't really see that there is a great wish anywhere to change the formal independence of central banks. But politicians will always want other people to do things that would benefit their own short-run interests. That's where central banks will remain solid and maintain their independence in respect of monetary policy. And they have every incentive to do so, in my view.
Someone else? No?
Well, I'll add briefly. I mean, clearly, there are many cases where, given the central bank's independence, politicians will look to the central bank, as Mervyn's saying, to do something they should do, but they don't want to do, or political interests will say want something to do with inequality or something to do with the environment that they're not getting through the political system, and they'll view the central bank perhaps as an end around being able to implement it. But of course, at the end of the day, the central bank can't take political decisions consistently and maintain its independence. There are deep crises where the central bank just has to act. But I think in that case, it again is looking to the political system to back it up. If you go to developing economies, the normal rhythm of things is the central bank moves, but then the Treasury kind of takes over everything it did, and everybody knows that that's coming, and so it works that way because the central bank can move so quickly. But it needs to be very wary of taking political decisions.
Stefan.
Outside the topic of the panel, but since Ken, you are on the panel, I'll ask you anyway. You wrote a nice little book called The Curse of Cash, and in this environment, cash is disappearing. So, what's your advice?
Well, isn't it wonderful that the people who organized this event had a panel just before us about this? But no, I think one of the things that's been very naive about I will call them crypto evangelists, is that they can somehow do something better and have an end around. And in fact, if you look at the history of money, which is probably what I should have called my book, and you look at the private sector always invents everything, but for many reasons, the governments eventually regulate it and even sometimes appropriate it. And I think, that's what we're seeing going forward in the digital space. You need rules of the road. And I was going to bring it up earlier, but I have to mention FTX. That was kind of a success for the regulatory community. It didn't do anything. It's the $32 billion at the heart of the crypto system just had no effect. And I think it shows how you need some regulatory structure to provide guardrails, and the central banks need to do that. But anyway, I've learned from you over the years on this issue, so thank you for asking that question.
Since we're spiraling out of control here with questions about anything, we should try to wrap up. So all good things must come to an end, and I'm not going to try to summarize what has been said, but I'd like to end with some final remarks. But really just 1 minute for each of you to summarize for the audience, which is the most important thing that we should take away from the panel. If you had to expound on one, which would that be? Who wants to take that first? Jay?
So I'll just conclude by saying that for us, central bank independence is a matter of statute. It's not in our Constitution. It's just an institutional arrangement that has served the public well, nothing more, nothing less. And as long as it does serve the public well over time, then I think it's safe, and I think it's safe now. But that means we've got to be committed to achieving our goals and to sticking to this precious grant of independence. To keep it, we need to deserve it, and that means stick to that work and don't look for broader things. Where it was discussed at the first panel, really, we shouldn't be getting ahead of where the public is if there's no specific mandate. And in the case of the U.S., that's a particularly salient point today.
Claudia?
Yeah, no,
What's your bottom line?
I fully agree with what Jay just said, and that's also, again, when you look at the German history, so sticking to the mandate and deliver, I mean, this is what's building trust. And I think when it comes to financial stability, we're actually at a critical juncture because the system has not been fully tested, so we have to make sure that we also deliver on both of our mandates, price and financial stability.
Erwin?
All good things do not have to come to an end, and central bank independence is one of them. And I think the point that comes out of all this is you can have a debate about whether interest rates should go up, and if so, by how much, or go down a bit. That's to do with the actual decision that's being made in a moment. But institutional arrangements matter. They really matter, and that's why central bank independence, I suspect, will live longer than many good ideas.
I also believe central bank independence will go on for many decades to come. It's hard to know forever. And I would just again argue, as I said in my remarks, that it's really been maybe the most successful policy innovation post-World War II and continues to be.
Okay. Let's stop at that and take early coffee. Thank you, with a big applause to the panel.
Thank you.
Okay.